Welcome to the COVID Ethics Series podcast, a conversation with leading experts about bioethical issues that have been exacerbated due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Bryan Pilkington, and I teach bioethics at Seton Hall University and at the Hackensack Meridian School of Medicine. I moderate the COVID Ethics Series in cooperation with the IHS Library and IHS Student Life. This podcast is a spin-off collaboration with the IHS Library, where we'll have the opportunity to go deep with the experts from our series. Thanks for joining our conversation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the COVID Ethics Series podcast. My name, as many of you know, is Bryan Pilkington, and I teach ethics at the Hackensack Meridian School of Medicine and at Seton Hall University in the School of Health and Medical Sciences and the College of Nursing. It is my great pleasure to be speaking with Eli Adachi, the former Dean of Medicine and Biological Sciences at Brown University. Dr. Adachi is an academic. He's a physician. He's been an executive and is the first graduate of the Tel Aviv University School of Medicine. He also spent time at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health program and healthcare management. I could read through an amazingly long CV, but I'm so glad that you're here with us today, Eli. As I mentioned when we chatted in the break, I'm a big fan of your work and I've learned a lot. I mean, you're prolific. There's article after article after article. And it's just really great to have you on the podcast. So welcome.
Thank you.
So we could ask you about a host of different topics, but what I want to spend our time on today is how to end the pandemic. So the COVID Ethics Series began thinking about ethical issues that arose in the pandemic. We are still going. Many folks thought we would have wrapped this up before. The death toll is very high. Lots of folks have been sick, and you've done work in this area. Help our audience think through how we might end the pandemic.
Right. Well, I would say in general, we need to do at least two things. Number one, we need to do our very best to make it difficult for the virus to replicate and mutate. And the way we can do that is by developing and administering intranasal vaccines, which would preclude the virus from entering our upper airways, and which is where the disease begins, of course. But in so doing, will prevent the virus from living space, you might say, wherein it multiplies and mutates. So you gain really two advantages by so doing. One is you and I will have less to worry about in terms of contracting the disease, assuming many of our fellow men and women choose to vaccinate themselves with the intranasal vaccine. I don't think the anti-vax movement is going to disappear tomorrow, so we can't assume that. But the more of us do it, the less likely you and I are going to be living in fear of contracting COVID. And more importantly, we would be curtailing the living space of the virus. And in so doing, in the long run, assuming this is done globally, we can hopefully come to a better place when it comes to COVID. So that would be step number one. For the foreseeable future, all of us will have to be protected against the significant likelihood of succumbing to the disease if we don't immunize systemically. In other words, I don't think we can do away with the intramuscular parenteral injections for the foreseeable future unless we can show that either the intranasal vaccine is also affording systemic immunity, or vice versa, that the systemic vaccine introduces upper respiratory tract immunity. Now, because the virus mutates and changes, ideally, both the intranasal vaccine and the ongoing intramuscular or parenteral vaccine would be best served by what is known as the universal quality, which is to say, be designed in such a way that will capture potentially all future variants. In other words, identify a particular sequence in the viral genome or viral protein sequence that is unchangeable, irrespective of the development of mutants, assuming we can identify such a universal sequence. And if we can, then we can immunize against that universal sequence and thereby spare ourselves repeated injections, which is currently the practice, of course. You and I, in all likelihood, had by now maybe 5 different injections, depending on what product you use. But if you, for example, are using the Pfizer product, I suspect you've had 5 or 6 intramuscular injections by now. The most recent one being the booster that seeks to address the Omicron variant and some of its relatives. So to recap, really two things. One is we need universality of the vaccine if it exists. And if so, generate the appropriate vaccine, which would essentially then get us into an annual pattern, not unlike that which we follow with influenza and other vaccines, on the assumption that it will be good for a year. Because the titers do go down over time, especially in senior citizens, but not just. And so that would be one element. The intranasal vaccine will accomplish 2 things. It will give us a freedom we currently do not enjoy. We may, in fact, be feeling much better about taking our masks off and still feel sufficiently protected to mix in society without second thoughts. And also in so doing, as I said, constrain the living space of the virus, which is so important, but which will only be totally effective the more people pursue that option. I would say that, in theory at least, if everybody on this planet were to be willing to have a small sniff, really, of a vaccine that will be sprayed, let's say, into your nostrils, if all of humanity pursued this little exercise, which should be painless, we can actually, probably theoretically, claim that the virus will be history, because it will have nowhere to thrive except perhaps in the original animal source that it likely came from. But at least as far as a human reservoir, in principle, we could put all of this behind us. Now, of course, I put a lot of qualifiers in what I shared with you. We mentioned the anti-vax movement. We probably should mention the fact that not all nations, particularly poor nations, are in fact appropriately supplied and equipped to do what we just said. And so perfection is going to elude us here. It's not going to happen. But at least we know, in principle, what it would take to put this very unfortunate recent experience of ours behind us, potentially for good, because unless the virus develops wholly new properties that we haven't planned on, then that's it. At least we've dealt with that one. Lord knows there'll be others coming down the line, so we can't take too much comfort in such an accomplishment. But theoretically, and to answer your question, this is our view on what it would take to move forward and leave this in the rear view mirror, if at all possible.
I want to pick up on one of the themes. You mentioned the anti-vax movement, and I share your opinion. I don't think this is going away soon. I was curious if maybe one of the additional benefits of the intranasal vaccines is just from sort of an ethics argument perspective. We've heard folks from the anti-vax movement be concerned about, we'll say to be diplomatic, the invasiveness of the intramuscular vaccine, right? So it's when there are arguments rooted in conscience and other kinds of things, we often hear there's something very invasive about this when you run analogies and talk about comparisons where folks seem to care a lot about this vaccine, but not about other kinds of things, which might seem similar. So any thoughts you might have on whether there may actually be even more success given the intranasal vaccines because they seem less invasive to folks?
Yes, no, I think I follow what you're saying. I'm not sure there is a satisfactory retort to this. If I had to guess, I would say that the anti-vax movement is not so much about the discomfort of intramuscular injection, but has a principal view that perhaps you and I may not share, but represents a long streak, a long-lasting streak of views that seem to be very American, you might say. If you go back to the Scopus trial, for example, in Tennessee, quite some time ago now, I think that gives you a sense of an element of the American psyche that has strong feelings about science, about vaccination, that are not necessarily shared by their fellow Americans, but these are long-held views, as I said, going way back. It's hard to say exactly where it fits. Does it have something to do with the drive westward, with American individualism, with the very fact that the Mayflower essentially started something completely new that allowed the flourishing of opinions that are not necessarily mainstream? I really don't have a satisfactory answer to that, other than to recognize the fact that the anti-vaccine movement is probably here to stay. It is a movement that's based on certain convictions that you and I may not share, as I said, but I think they must be considered and recognized and appreciated for what it is. So absent, in other words, I don't think the fact that intranasal vaccines may come our way, and by the way, I don't expect that before the end of next year. Unfortunately, I say this, unless we import an Indian vaccine, which is already ready to go and is being distributed in India. It's possible that it will make its way here. But locally produced vaccines are going to take a while. So much of what we said today is theoretical from that point of view, in that I'd be very surprised if the trials that are currently listed on clinicaltrials.gov are going to make it to the FDA and to the approval process and the distribution process before the end of next year. I could be wrong, but I would tend to err on the conservative side.
That's really helpful. And for all the students who listen to the podcast, especially the bioethics students, I very much appreciate how you framed that answer, both in terms of the history, taking us back to the Scopes trial, but also the context, right, of what's going on. I think that's the right way to approach ethics challenges in medicine and science. I wanted to pick up on a second theme that you mentioned, a challenge to the potential perfect solution, which had to do with distribution globally. So you noted there are some nations which may have, I assume, greater infrastructure challenges in pulling this off. And so I have a cluster of questions. Pick up any you like. I mean, is there an ethical mandate for those who have this kind of vaccines in India to share it more widely? Do leaders of nations need to come together even more so than they have done? Does there need to be more cooperation? Is this just too multifaceted and convoluted? So any sort of general thoughts about addressing the scope of the globe as opposed to an individual nation?
Right. Well, this, of course, came up when this pandemic began. And the United States, I think, as a nation, contributed to less fortunate nations at the time, and potentially still as we speak, although I am not up on the details. And then, of course, there are several not-for-profit organizations that dedicate themselves to this very mission. And so I think the United States is doing its part, both officially as a nation, as well as by another very, I think, characteristic American streak, and that is, the care we show to those less fortunate in nations who, for one reason or another, cannot afford to enjoy the kind of abundance of vaccine, for example, that we were treated to. So I would say, to just answer your first question, this has not been absent from the scene, and in my opinion, needs to be maintained clearly in our best interest, among other things, as I mentioned, because the more extensive the immunization process, nasally or otherwise, the more constrained the virus will be globally, and the less impactful it will become. So it's not only ethically imperative that we reach out to the less fortunate, but it is in our very best interest from a practical point of view, because if we don't all band together to exclude the virus or preclude it from its living space, we are probably not going to eliminate it entirely, which means we're going to be left with, at the very least, annual parenteral injections and potentially renewable intranasal vaccinations, because that too is unlikely to last a lifetime. So I would say, to answer your question, there's little question but that we should continue to think about nations who are less self-sufficient, less well-endowed, less fortunate than we are, and extend a helping hand to them, if at all possible.
Before I let you go, I wanted to ask about education and educating sort of physician colleagues, future physician colleagues, educating health profession students. So we've seen, and you've done some work analyzing this as well, but we've seen a rise in violence and hostilities towards healthcare workers. For folks who listen to the podcast regularly, we had Nancy Berlinger of the Hastings Center on 2 weeks ago, who discussed some of the challenges of occupational stress more broadly. So Eli, for students in medical school, future health professionals, any words of advice or recommendations as they enter the workforce sort of during COVID, during future pandemics, and with the additional stress that appears to be put on physicians and other healthcare professionals?
Yes, no, you're right. We have noted, as have others, of course, or maybe we simply better documented incidents of violence in healthcare settings, although some of them were so unthinkable. By that I mean patients killing physicians and the like. I mean, when you stop and think about it, I really have not explored the history of such a phenomenon, but I became aware of it about in 2015 when a patient walked into the Brigham Hospital in Boston and ended up killing his or his mother's cardiologist in cold blood. Of course, we had the Tulsa experience recently and others. And so perhaps by dint of better communication, we are all becoming more sensitized to the fact. But there's also been a growing effort to account for these events, meaning actually follow the numbers, if you will, and try to estimate trends that way. Is this getting worse, getting better, staying the same? But if you were to ask me in general, we would have to assume that some modicum of violence in a healthcare context is likely to be a more or less permanent phenomenon. The degree for which is another question, which is exactly where we often come down on the issue, and we say that it's very important that every effort be made to protect healthcare professionals. And that's really the responsibility of the facilities wherein they are employed. Mostly that refers to hospitals, but I don't see why we wouldn't, shouldn't, couldn't invest in the security of clinics, community health centers, you name it. It could happen anywhere. It seems like the emphasis in the last few years was on hospitals, but that does not mean that it will always be that way. I think that recognition is increasingly sinking in, meaning hospital CEOs, hospital boards, physicians, I think, are increasingly recognizing the import of improving local security. And I would also say that more and more outside bodies like CMS, like AHRQ, like the ICGME, and others are building staff security into their funding and their overall plans. I recently saw several reports from these organizations and perhaps others suggesting that that awareness is now sinking in. There's also a law that I don't believe has been enacted, but I mean, there's legislation in front of Congress that is committed to providing healthcare institutions with grants that would help them improve home security, if you will. Once that bill is enacted, and I suspect it will be enacted, that will provide additional funds, which we understand are scarce to begin with and are hard to draw upon when other priorities compete incessantly. But this will help. It may not be enough. It may not nip the problem in the bud, but it will make some positive difference. And I think that's probably the best we can hope for at this time.
Thank you, Eli. So yeah, I mean, future legislation, hopefully, which will help to better protect those healthcare professionals who are working. The phrase "on the front lines" and all the military analogies, which have been used throughout COVID, I think really strikes home here. So, thank you so much for the time. For those listening in, I've been speaking with Dr. Eli Adachi, the former Dean of Medicine and Biological Sciences at Brown University, and currently tenured professor of medical science with the Warren Alpert Medical School of Brown University. We will post a number of articles from Professor Adachi on the webpage with links connected to this podcast. So, Eli, thanks so much for being with us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the COVID Ethics Series podcast. Be sure to check out video versions of our episodes online at library.shu.edu/COVID-ethics. Follow the show on Twitter at ShuBioethics and our moderator, me, at BCP Ethics. And if you're listening to this show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, please subscribe and leave a review. If there's a topic you'd like to see discussed in the future, let us know.